If you're new here, please subscribe to our channel and like this video. It only takes a second, but it gives us the motivation to create more stories. So please like this video. And now, let's begin the story. I never imagined I would find myself in this situation. Growing up in a quiet coastal town, I dreamed of a simple, happy life. I married my high school sweetheart, Daniel, when we were both young and full of hope. We didn't have much, but we had each other, and that was enough, or so I thought. Looking back now, I can see the signs of what was coming, but at the time, I never would have imagined it. I met Mr. Carter, our landlord, when Daniel and I first moved into the charming little cottage we rented. The house wasn't grand, but it had character. A small garden, a wraparound porch, and a backyard I absolutely adored. Daniel and I were excited about this new chapter in our lives. Mr. Carter, a man in his early 60s, had a warm smile and an easygoing demeanor. He would check in occasionally to make sure everything was all right with the house. I still remember the first time he came by to repair a broken gate. He was polite, always asking if we needed anything, and often reminisced about how the neighborhood had changed over the years. At the time, I thought nothing of it. He was just a friendly older man. But as time went on, things began to shift. Daniel's new job required him to travel frequently, leaving me alone at the house more often than not. It was during those times that I started to notice Mr. Carter differently. His visits became more frequent, sometimes to check on the house, other times just to chat. At first I didn't mind, after all he was our landlord, but gradually our conversations took on a different tone and I began to feel an unease I couldn't quite place. One afternoon, I was in the backyard, tending to my small vegetable garden, when Mr. Carter arrived unexpectedly. He had been stopping by more often lately, and though I appreciated the company, there was something about his presence that felt different. He lingered longer than usual that day. We talked about the weather, the garden, and life in general. Then, out of nowhere, he asked, "Are you happy here?" His eyes held mine in a way that made me feel exposed. I hesitated, unsure how to answer. Of course I loved Daniel, but with his long work hours, I had started to feel a distance growing between us. There were moments of loneliness even when he was home, but I wasn't about to admit that to Mr. Carter, not out loud. I smiled and nodded, trying to shake off the discomfort, but he didn't let it go so easily. "Sometimes," he said, his voice softer, "it's easy to forget how important it is to have someone who really listens, who truly sees you." His words lingered in the air long after he left. I told myself it was just a harmless conversation, yet something about it sent a shiver down my spine. The more he came around, the more I began to notice subtle changes in his behavior. His compliments, once casual, began to carry more weight. What once felt like friendly check-ins started to feel more like calculated visits. One evening, as the sun cast long golden shadows across the yard, Mr. Carter arrived unannounced. He stood at the gate, watching me for a moment before stepping closer. "You know, Claire," he said, "there's something about you, something rare." I laughed nervously. "I think you might be giving me too much credit, Mr. Carter." "Please," he said, shaking his head, "call me James." It was the first time he had asked me to use his first name, and it unsettled me. Before I could respond, he took another step forward, his voice lowering. "You deserve to be cherished." My heart pounded in my chest. I I should get inside," I stammered. He nodded, but there was something in his expression that told me this wasn't the end of it. I rushed inside, locking the door behind me, trying to calm the storm of emotions swirling inside me. That night, as I lay beside Daniel, I couldn't shake the feeling that everything was beginning to change. I wasn't used to the way James would comment on how nice I looked, how well I took care of myself, and how beautifully I maintained the house. At first, I thought he was just being kind, but soon it felt like he was noticing things no one else did. One evening, Daniel was away on a business trip. It was a quiet night, and I was curled up on the couch with a book when the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I hesitated before answering. When I opened the door, there stood James with a smile on his face. "I was just in the neighborhood," he said. "Thought I'd stop by and make sure everything was all right." I smiled politely, stepping back to let him in. By now, it had become normal for him to stop by unannounced, so I didn't think much of it. He walked into the living room and we began talking, just as we always did. But this time, I sensed a strange tension in the air. Something about the way he looked at me made me uneasy. It wasn't anything overt, just a look, a lingering gaze, but it was enough to make my heart race. As we talked, James sat closer than usual. The space between us shrank and his presence felt heavier. I remember laughing awkwardly at something he said, trying to brush off the growing discomfort in my chest. I told myself he was just being friendly, that I was overreacting, but then, as if sensing my unease, James leaned in slightly and placed his hand gently on the arm of the couch. "You know," he said, "it's rare to meet someone like you, someone who really listens, who truly cares." The words seemed innocent enough, but something in his tone, in the way he said them, made my skin crawl. I wanted to move away, to tell him I was uncomfortable, but I didn't. Instead, I laughed nervously and pulled my legs up to my chest, trying to create some distance between us, even if it was just physical. James noticed the shift in my posture. For a moment, there was silence between us. He looked at me, his eyes soft, but there was a sharpness behind them I couldn't ignore. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable," he said, his voice low. I just wanted you to know that you're appreciated. You're a very special person, Claire." The way he said my name made my breath catch. My heart pounded in my chest, and I didn't know how to respond. I wanted to say something, anything to break the tension, but I couldn't find the words. It was as if I were trapped in the moment, frozen in place. Before I could say anything, James stood up. "Well, I should let you get back to your evening," he said, smiling again. But there was something strange in that smile, something I couldn't quite place. "Just wanted to check in and make sure you're okay." I nodded, my throat dry, and watched as he left the house. When the door clicked shut behind him, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. I sat there, staring at the door for what felt like an eternity, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I had never felt so conflicted in my life. Part of me wanted to tell Daniel what had been going on, but another part of me was too ashamed. too afraid of what he might think. I didn't want to cause problems. I didn't want him to doubt me or worse, to get angry. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I couldn't ignore the way James was making me feel. It wasn't right, and I didn't want to encourage it, yet a part of me feared what would happen next. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to James's visits than he was letting on. What was I supposed to do? As the days passed, his visits became more frequent. Each time he came by, I felt that same discomfort creeping in, an unease I couldn't quite place. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was overthinking things, but it was becoming harder to ignore. There was something about him that made my pulse quicken, and I couldn't figure out why. I knew I had to be careful, that I couldn't let things get out of hand, but deep down, something was shifting. I just didn't know yet how deep it would go. Days turned into weeks, and the tension between James and me only grew. I still hadn't told Daniel about the strange interactions with our landlord. Part of me feared he wouldn't understand, or worse, that he'd be angry with me. After all, I was just trying to be polite, wasn't I? It was just small talk, nothing more, right? That's what I told myself every time James showed up unannounced, trying to dismiss my unease as nothing more than my imagination. But the unease wasn't something I could ignore anymore. I couldn't stop thinking about the way he had looked at me, the way his fingers had rested on the armrest of the couch during his last visit, as if he were trying to create a connection. A connection that didn't feel entirely appropriate. I would catch myself replaying the moment over and over in my mind, each time feeling the tension growing inside me. It was a quiet Tuesday evening when I found myself alone in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner. Cooking had always been a comfort to me, a moment of peace in the chaos of life. But tonight, it felt different. My mind was elsewhere, distracted, unsettled. Something felt off. I was just starting to season the chicken when I heard the familiar sound of the doorbell. My heart skipped a beat. I glanced toward the kitchen window, and sure enough, there he was. James, standing at the door with his usual warm smile. I hadn't seen him in a couple of days, and while I should have felt relieved, I instead felt a strange knot forming in my stomach. I wiped my hands on a towel, took a deep breath, and walked to the door. "Good evening, Claire," James said cheerfully as I opened it. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything." "No, not at all," I replied, forcing a polite smile. I stepped aside to let him in, and he entered without hesitation, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. He glanced around, his eyes briefly settling on the kitchen where I had been preparing dinner. "Smells wonderful in here," he commented, his gaze lingering on the meal I was making. "You're quite the cook." I nodded politely, unsure of how to respond. "It's just something simple for dinner, nothing special." "You always say that," James chuckled, "but you have a way of making the simplest things seem extraordinary." It was a nice compliment, but something about it unsettled me. It didn't feel like the kind of compliment I was used to receiving from Daniel, from friends. There was a weight to it, an underlying meaning I couldn't quite decipher. I felt myself growing uneasy again, but I pushed the feeling away, reminding myself that I was probably overthinking it. "Thank you," I said, brushing it off. "Do you need anything? I assume you're here to check on something." James's expression shifted slightly. He seemed to hesitate before responding. Well, actually, I was wondering if we could talk for a moment, James said. It's been a while since we've had a proper conversation. I was caught off guard. We had always exchanged pleasantries when he came by, but we had never sat down for a long discussion. I knew he had been around the neighborhood more often lately, but I hadn't expected him to want to talk so deeply. A flicker of anxiety passed through me, but I nodded anyway. Sure, we can sit down. I led him to the living room and gestured for him to take a seat on the couch. I sat across from him in the chair where I usually curled up when Daniel and I watched TV. A brief silence filled the room, awkward and heavy, before James finally spoke again. His tone was more serious than I had ever heard it before. You know, he began slowly, I've been thinking a lot about life lately, about how things change over time. It's easy to get caught up in the day-to-day and forget what really matters. I wasn't sure where he was going with this. I know what you mean, I said cautiously. Life gets busy, and sometimes it's hard to keep track of what's important. James nodded, his eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made me shift uncomfortably. Exactly. But it's also important to remember that sometimes we need to take a step back and make sure we're truly living, not just going through the motions. There was something about his words that unsettled me, though I couldn't quite put my finger on why. I hesitated, unsure of how to respond. The way he was looking at me sent a ripple of unease through my chest. Claire, he said softly, leaning forward just slightly. I don't know how to explain this, but I've felt a connection with you ever since I met you. A special connection that I haven't been able to ignore. I felt my breath catch in my throat. His words were kind, but they felt like a confession. Something about the way he said them made my pulse race, but not in a good way. A strange tension filled the air, suffocating and inescapable. I can't tell you how many times I've thought about our conversations, James continued. The way you carry yourself, your kindness, your presence. You're a remarkable woman. It's hard to put into words just how much I admire you. I suddenly felt trapped, uncertain of how to respond. My mind raced, searching desperately for the right words, something to diffuse the tension that now hung thick between us. I don't know what to say, I murmured, my voice barely above a whisper. I appreciate the compliment, James, but I'm married. I love my husband very much. He didn't seem fazed by my words. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, studying me for a moment, his expression unreadable. I understand, he said quietly, his voice almost apologetic. I don't want to make you uncomfortable, Claire, but I also don't want to pretend that I don't feel what I feel. His words sent a jolt of unease through me. He had expressed admiration for me before, but this was different. There was something deeper in his gaze, something more intense, more deliberate. A mix of fear and confusion flooded through me. This wasn't just a friendly landlord checking in. This was something else, something I wasn't sure how to handle. I don't want to cause any problems between you and Daniel, James continued, his voice softer now. But I couldn't keep pretending that I didn't feel drawn to you. I just had to tell you. I didn't know what to say. My mouth opened, but no words came out. I didn't want to hurt him, but I also didn't want to give him any false hope. What was I supposed to do? How could I make him understand that I was married and not interested in pursuing anything outside of my relationship with Daniel? Finally, I found my voice. James, I think it's best if we keep things professional. I don't want there to be any misunderstandings. For a moment, he simply stared at me, his expression unreadable. Then he sighed, nodding slowly. I respect that, he said, though there was something in his tone that suggested otherwise. He stood up, running a hand through his hair. I should go. I exhaled, my shoulders sinking with relief as I stood as well, leading him to the door. He paused for a moment before stepping outside, turning back to meet my gaze one last time. You really are something special, Claire, he said quietly. Then, with a small, knowing smile, he walked away into the night. As soon as the door shut behind him, I let out a shaky breath. My hands trembled slightly as I pressed them against the cool wood of the door, trying to steady myself. My heart was still pounding, my mind racing with what had just happened. I needed to tell Daniel. I had to tell him. But even as I told myself that, I hesitated. Would he believe me? Would he be angry? Would he think I had done something to encourage James? I didn't know. But what I did know was that things had just changed, and I couldn't pretend otherwise anymore. I took a deep breath, my heart pounding in my chest. James, I said firmly, I understand that you're being honest, but I need to be clear with you. I'm married, and I'm committed to my husband. I appreciate your kindness, but I'm not interested in anything more than a landlord-tenant relationship. There was a long pause, and I saw the disappointment flicker in his eyes. He looked down at his hands, then nodded slowly. I understand, he said quietly. I'm sorry if I made you feel uncomfortable. That was never my intention. I nodded, feeling a wave of relief wash over me. The tension between us seemed to dissipate, but it left behind a lingering unease. I couldn't shake the feeling that things would never be the same again, that James's feelings for me would continue to exist whether I acknowledged them or not. He stood up and I followed suit. Thank you for listening, he said, his voice still soft but carrying a hint of sadness. I'll leave you to your evening. Please know that I respect your boundaries, Claire. I just wanted you to know how I felt. I forced a smile, trying to mask the unease still bubbling inside me. Thank you, James, I said. I'll see you around. As he walked out the door, I stood there for a moment, staring at the empty space where he had been. My thoughts were a whirlwind. I couldn't believe what had just happened. I was married to Daniel, and yet I had just had this conversation with our landlord. What was going on? And why did it feel like my entire world was slowly unraveling? I shook my head, trying to push away the doubt. I had to focus on my life with Daniel, to remember the love and commitment we shared. But deep inside, a small, nagging feeling told me that this was far from over. After that conversation with James, I tried to push the entire situation out of my mind. I didn't want it to affect my relationship with Daniel, and I definitely didn't want to complicate things with our landlord any further. But even though I buried my feelings, they didn't disappear. The guilt and confusion lingered, and I found myself constantly second-guessing the interaction. A few days later, the doorbell rang unexpectedly. My heart tightened in my chest as I glanced toward the front door. I wasn't ready for another awkward conversation, but I knew I had to face it head on. Taking a deep breath, I opened the door. "Hello, Claire," James greeted me, his voice warm but careful. "I just wanted to check in and make sure everything's still good with the house." I nodded, forcing a polite smile. "Everything's fine, James. Thanks for asking." He seemed to hesitate before continuing. "I've been thinking a lot about what I said last time. I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable. I understand your boundaries and I respect that. I just didn't want to leave things unsaid." I looked at him for a long moment, feeling the weight of his words. This was my moment to be firm. There was no room for uncertainty. "Thank you for understanding," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "But I need to be clear. My focus is on my marriage with Daniel, and I can't allow any distractions. I value our professional relationship, but that's where it ends." James's expression softened, but there was still a hint of sadness in his eyes. He nodded slowly, accepting my words without protest. "I understand," he said quietly. "I'm sorry if I overstepped." I took a deep breath, feeling another wave of relief. "It's okay. I just wanted to make sure we're on the same page." He gave a small, respectful nod and turned to leave. As he walked away, I stood in the doorway watching him go, feeling a mix of emotions. Part of me felt sad that it had come to this, but another part was grateful that I had finally set the boundaries I needed. That evening, Daniel and I sat down for dinner. For the first time in weeks, I felt truly present. The events of the past days weighed on me, but I knew I had to move forward. My focus needed to be on what mattered: my family, my commitment to Daniel, and the love we shared. "Everything okay?" Daniel asked, noticing my quiet demeanor. I smiled, pushing the lingering thoughts aside. "Yeah, just thinking, it's good to have you home." He smiled back, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. "It's good to be home." In that moment, I realized that no matter the confusion or the complexity of human emotions, my priority was clear. I had to protect the relationship I had with Daniel. I wasn't going to let anything or anyone get in the way of that. And I knew that no matter what, we would get through it together.